It was a quiet Friday evening in a suburban neighborhood, the kind of place where people waved at each other while walking their dogs and kids, played basketball on driveways. Everything seemed normal, almost too normal. But sometimes, even in the most ordinary moments, life throws you into situations that change everything. A man who had just returned from visiting his family was driving home. He wasn't anyone special to look at. He wore jeans, a simple t-shirt, and carried the calm confidence of someone who had seen more than most people could imagine. This man was no stranger to challenges. He had spent years serving his country as a Navy SEAL, facing danger head-on without hesitation. Yet, tonight, he found himself dealing with something entirely different, a situation that would test not only his patience, but also his resolve. As he drove through the streets, humming along to the radio, red and blue lights flashed behind him. At first, he thought it might be for someone else, but then he realized the siren was meant for him. Confused, he pulled over carefully, making sure to follow all the rules. After all, he knew what it meant to respect authority. As he rolled down his window, he greeted the officer politely, expecting nothing more than a routine traffic stop. The officer approached the car with an air of authority, his flashlight sweeping across the interior. "License and registration," he demanded, his tone sharp and clipped. The driver handed them over without argument, still unsure why he'd been stopped. His car was clean, his documents were in order, and he hadn't broken any laws. Or so he thought. When the officer glanced at the license, his demeanor shifted slightly. There was something in his eyes, something that made the driver uneasy. Without explanation, the officer began asking questions, probing about where he was coming from, where he was headed, and whether the car belonged to him. The answers didn't seem to satisfy him. Instead of wrapping up the stop, he lingered, his tone growing colder with every passing minute. Then came the comment, the one that hit like a punch to the gut. "You know, people like you don't usually drive cars like this," the officer said, gesturing vaguely toward the vehicle. The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. People like you. It wasn't hard to read between the lines. The driver felt anger bubbling inside him, but he swallowed it down. He'd learned long ago how to keep his emotions in check, especially in high-pressure situations. Instead, he calmly asked, "Is there a specific reason I've been pulled over?" The question seemed to irritate the officer further. "Your taillight is out," he snapped, though it was clear that wasn't the real issue here. A broken taillight? Really? That's what this whole thing was about? The driver couldn't help but feel like there was more going on beneath the surface. What happened next only confirmed his suspicions. The officer started writing ticket after ticket, each one piling onto the growing stack. Some of the infractions were minor, almost laughable if they weren't so frustrating. And yet, the driver remained composed, refusing to give the officer any excuse to escalate the situation further. By the time the stop ended, the driver was left holding a handful of tickets, none of which felt fair or justified. But as he drove away, he realized this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about standing up for what was right, for demanding accountability when the system failed. He decided then and there that he wouldn't let this slide. He wasn't going to sit back and accept injustice quietly. No, he would fight not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been treated unfairly because of the color of their skin. Little did he know, this decision would set off a chain reaction, bringing attention to issues far bigger than a single traffic stop. But for now, all he could do was take it one step at a time, preparing himself for the battle ahead. The driver sat in his living room that night, staring at the stack of tickets on the coffee table. His mind raced with thoughts about what had just happened. He replayed the scene over and over again, the flashing lights, the officer's tone, the way those words had landed like a punch to the gut. It wasn't just about the tickets. It was about being treated like he didn't belong, like he was somehow less worthy because of the color of his skin. He leaned back on the couch, letting out a deep sigh. For years he had served his country, risking his life in places most people couldn't even imagine. He had faced danger, made sacrifices, and earned respect from teammates who came from all walks of life. But here, in his own neighborhood, he felt like an outsider. The irony wasn't lost on him, but sitting there, feeling angry and frustrated, he realized something important. This wasn't just about him. If he let this go, if he accepted it as another unfortunate part of life, then nothing would ever change. And he couldn't live with that, so he made a decision he would fight back. Not with violence or anger, but with facts, preparation, and determination. The next morning, he started looking for help. After some research, he found a lawyer who specialized in civil rights cases. She was known for taking on tough battles against powerful institutions, and her track record spoke for itself. When they met for the first time, she listened carefully as he explained what had happened. Her expression remained calm, but there was a flicker of intensity in her eyes. "This isn't just about traffic tickets," she said finally. "This is about holding someone accountable when they abuse their power. Are you ready for that?" He nodded without hesitation. "I'm ready." From that moment on, the two of them got to work. They spent hours going over every detail of the traffic stop, what the officer had said, how he had acted, and whether anything seemed unusual. They reviewed the bodycam footage frame by frame, searching for inconsistencies or signs of bias. Every word, every gesture mattered. One thing became clear early on. This wasn't the first time the officer had been accused of misconduct. Through their investigation, they uncovered several past complaints filed against him by other drivers. Some were dismissed, while others resulted in minor disciplinary actions that barely scratched the surface. But together, these incidents painted a troubling picture. "They think they can get away with it," the lawyer said one afternoon, shaking her head, "because no one ever pushes back hard enough." "Well, we're pushing back now," the driver replied firmly. As they dug deeper, they also reached out to witnesses. A neighbor who had been walking her dog nearby during the traffic stop remembered seeing the interaction. She described how the officer's demeanor had changed almost immediately after approaching the car. Another person who had driven past confirmed the same thing. These small details might not seem like much, but they added up, building a stronger case. While the legal side of things was progressing, the driver found himself reflecting on the bigger picture. Fighting this battle wasn't easy. It required time, energy, and money. But more than that, it meant putting himself out there, knowing full well that not everyone would support him. There were already whispers in the community. Some people thought he was making too big a deal out of nothing. Others questioned why he couldn't just pay the fines and move on, but he knew better. This wasn't just about a broken taillight or a few unfair tickets. It was about standing up for justice, for fairness, for equality. It was about showing others that it was possible to challenge the system, even when it felt impossible. To stay focused. He leaned on the lessons he'd learned during his time as a Navy SEAL: discipline, patience, and resilience. Those qualities had gotten him through some of the toughest moments of his life. Now, he needed them more than ever. He also drew strength from the people around him. Friends and family rallied behind him, offering encouragement and advice. One close friend reminded him of something simple yet profound. "You're not just fighting for yourself. You're fighting for everyone who doesn't have a voice." Those words stuck with him, fueling his determination. As the days turned into weeks, the preparations intensified. The lawyer helped him practice his testimony, coaching him on how to stay calm and composed under pressure. They went over possible questions the opposing side might ask, preparing responses that were truthful but strategic. "You've got to show them who you are," she told him during one session. "Not just as a driver or a citizen, but as a human being. Let them see your story, your values, your truth." He took her advice to heart. When he thought about stepping into that courtroom, he didn't see it as a place to win or lose. He saw it as a platform and opportunity to speak up for what was right. Still, doubts crept in occasionally. What if the judge didn't believe him? What if the system failed him again? Those fears were real, but he refused to let them paralyze him. Instead, he used them as motivation to keep pushing forward. In the final days before the trial, everything felt surreal. The anticipation hung heavy in the air. He double-checked his notes, rehearsed his testimony one last time, and tried to steady his nerves. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Facing off against someone in uniform, someone with authority, wasn't something anyone looked forward to. But he also knew he couldn't back down, not now, not ever, on the eve of the trial. He stood outside his house, looking up at the stars. The night was quiet, peaceful, almost. He thought about all. The people counting on him, all the stories like his that never got told. Tomorrow he would walk into that courtroom, ready to face whatever came his way, and as he stood there, he whispered to himself, "This isn't just my fight anymore. It's ours." With that, he turned and went inside, ready to take the next step in what had become far more than just a personal battle. The day of the trial arrived, and it felt like the entire town was holding its breath. The courtroom was packed with people, some curious bystanders, others supporters of the driver, and a few who were there to see how things would unfold, reporters. Scribbled notes in the back, cameras clicked softly outside, and whispers filled the air. It wasn't just another court case. It was a moment that had drawn attention far beyond the small suburban neighborhood where it all began. Inside, the atmosphere was tense but electric. The driver sat at the plaintiff's table, dressed neatly in his Navy uniform. His medals gleamed under the fluorescent lights, a quiet reminder of the years he'd spent serving his country. He looked calm on the surface, but inside his heart was racing. This was the moment he'd been preparing for. Across the aisle sat the officer, looking confident and unbothered. His colleagues from the police department had shown up to support him, filling several rows of the gallery. They exchanged nods and murmurs, their presence almost like a silent declaration of solidarity. To anyone watching, it seemed like the odds were stacked against the driver. After all, officers didn't often face consequences for their actions in court, but the driver knew better than to let appearances fool him. Today wasn't about what seemed likely, it was about what was right. When the judge entered the room, everyone stood. Judge Linda Ramirez was known for being fair, but firm. Someone who didn't shy away from tough decisions. As she took her seat, the room fell silent, and the proceedings began. The first to take the stand was the officer. Sworn in, he recounted the events of that night with practiced ease. According to him, the traffic stop had been routine broken. Taillight, a quick check of documents, nothing out of the ordinary. When asked why so many tickets had been issued, he explained that the driver had been uncooperative and argumentative, forcing him to escalate the situation. His tone was calm, matter of fact, but something about it didn't sit right with the audience. The lawyer representing the driver listened intently, jotting down notes. Then, when it was her turn to cross-examine, she stood up slowly, her eyes sharp and focused. "Officer," she began, "you mentioned that the driver was uncooperative. Can you give us an example of this behavior?" The officer hesitated for a split second before responding. "He questioned my authority repeatedly and seemed agitated throughout the stop." "Agitated?" the lawyer pressed. "Or perhaps he was simply confused as to why he was being treated differently than other drivers might be?" The question hung in the air, unanswered. From there, the lawyer moved quickly, dismantling the officer's narrative piece by piece. She pointed out inconsistencies between his testimony and the body cam footage. For instance, the video showed the driver remaining polite and composed, even when faced with accusations that clearly upset him. "Isn't it true," she asked at one point, "that you made comments about the type of car the driver was operating? Comments suggesting that someone like him shouldn't own such a vehicle?" The courtroom went still. The officer shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "I may have made a comment about the car," he admitted reluctantly. "But it was only because it raised suspicions given the circumstances." The lawyer arched an eyebrow. "Suspicious circumstances? Like what, exactly? A broken taillight?" A murmur rippled through the crowd. The officer's confidence wavered slightly, but he tried to recover. "It's my job to assess potential risks," he said defensively. "And yet," the lawyer countered, "there's no evidence in the footage or your report to suggest any risk beyond a minor traffic violation. Isn't that correct?" "Yes," he muttered, his voice quieter now. By the time the cross-examination ended, the cracks in the officer's story were impossible to ignore. The lawyer had done her job well, exposing not just the flaws in his, account but also the biases that had influenced his actions. Then came the driver's turn to testify. As he walked to the witness stand, the room seemed to hold its collective breath. There was something commanding about his presence, not arrogance, but a quiet strength that demanded respect. He swore to tell the truth and turned to face the judge and jury. For a moment he paused, gathering his thoughts. Then, in a steady voice, he began to speak. He described the events of that night, starting with the flashing lights in his rearview mirror and ending with the pile of tickets handed to him. He spoke plainly, without embellishment, letting the facts speak for themselves, but it was what he said next that truly resonated. "I've spent my life serving this country," he explained. "I've put myself in harm's way to protect others, regardless of who they are or where they come from. So when I'm treated like I don't belong in my own community, like I'm guilty until proven innocent simply because of the color of my skin, it hurts. Not just me, but everyone who believes in fairness and equality." His words struck a chord. People in the gallery nodded silently, some wiping tears from their eyes. Even the judge leaned forward slightly, listening intently, the lawyer guided him through additional questions, reinforcing key points and highlighting the broader implications of the case. She reminded everyone that this wasn't just about one man or one traffic stop, it was about accountability, about ensuring that those entrusted with power used it responsibly. When the driver finished speaking, the courtroom was eerily quiet. No one clapped or cheered, that wasn't allowed, but the weight of his testimony lingered in the air. It was clear that something significant had happened here today. As the session drew to a close, Judge Ramirez thanked both parties for their presentations. Her expression gave nothing away, but her tone was measured and thoughtful. "We'll reconvene tomorrow morning for closing arguments," she announced before adjourning the court. Outside, reporters swarmed the exits, eager for statements. Supporters gathered around the driver, offering hugs and words of encouragement. Despite the uncertainty of the verdict, he felt a sense of relief. He had said his piece, laid bare the truth, and stood firm in the face of adversity. Whatever happened next, he knew he'd done everything he could. Back home that evening, he reflected on the day's events. The battle wasn't over yet, but he could feel momentum building. People were talking not just about his case, but about the larger issues it represented. Change wouldn't come overnight, but every step forward mattered. And as he drifted off to sleep, exhausted but hopeful, he reminded himself of something important. This fight wasn't just for him. It was for everyone who deserved to be treated with dignity and respect. The next morning, the courtroom was even more crowded than the day before. Word had spread quickly about the powerful testimony delivered by the driver and the lawyer's sharp questioning of the officer. People wanted to see how it would all play out. Reporters jotted down notes furiously, while spectators whispered among themselves, speculating about what the judge might decide. The air felt heavy with anticipation, as though everyone knew they were witnessing something historic. When Judge Linda Ramirez entered the room, the crowd fell silent. She carried an aura of authority, her expression unreadable but commanding. As she settled into her seat, she glanced around the room, taking in the sea of faces. It was clear that this wasn't just another routine case, it was a moment that could ripple far beyond the walls of the courtroom. Closing arguments began with the lawyer representing the driver. Standing confidently at the podium, she wasted no time getting to the heart of the matter. "Your Honor," she began, "this case isn't about a broken taillight or a few traffic tickets. It's about fairness. It's about accountability. And most importantly, it's about whether we, as a society, are willing to hold those in power responsible when they abuse their authority." Her voice was calm but firm, each word landing like a stone dropped into still water. She walked the judge through the evidence again, the body cam footage showing the driver's respectful demeanor, the inconsistencies in the officer's testimony, and the pattern of past complaints against him. But she didn't stop there. She painted a bigger picture, one that connected this single incident to a larger issue affecting countless individuals. This man served his country with honor and courage, she continued, gesturing toward the driver seated nearby. He risked his life to protect others, regardless of race, background, or belief. Yet here, in his own community, he was treated as if he didn't belong, as if his achievements meant nothing compared to the color of his skin. That's not justice. That's not equality. That's unacceptable. Her words resonated deeply, not just with the judge, but with everyone in the room. Even some of the officers in attendance shifted uncomfortably in their seats. When she finished speaking, the courtroom remained silent for a long moment, the weight of her argument hanging in the air. Then it was the defense attorney's turn. Representing the officer, he argued that the traffic stop had been conducted properly and within the bounds of the law. He insisted that any perceived bias was unintentional and that the officer had simply been doing his duty. His tone was polished and professional, but it lacked the emotional impact of the opposing side's presentation. Finally, it was time for Judge Ramirez to deliver her verdict. She adjusted her glasses and leaned forward slightly, her gaze steady and deliberate. For a brief moment, the room seemed to stop breathing. Then she spoke, her voice clear and unwavering. After reviewing the evidence presented in this case, she began, I find that the charges brought against the plaintiff are unfounded and must be dismissed. There is insufficient justification for the number and nature of citations issued during the traffic stop. Furthermore, the conduct demonstrated by the defendant raises serious concerns about potential bias and misuse of authority. A murmur rippled through the courtroom, growing louder as people processed her words. The driver sat motionless, his hands clasped tightly together. Relief washed over him, but he stayed composed, letting the judge finish. Judge Ramirez wasn't done yet. She turned her attention directly to the officer, her tone hardening slightly. Law enforcement officers are entrusted with immense power and responsibility, she said. They are expected to uphold the law fairly and impartially, without prejudice or discrimination. When that trust is broken, it undermines the very foundation of our justice system. This court cannot ignore patterns of behavior that suggest misconduct. Therefore, I am formally reprimanding Officer Last Name and recommending further investigation into these allegations. The room erupted in applause, though it was quickly silenced by the bailiff's stern reminder of courtroom decorum. Still, the energy was undeniable. Supporters of the driver exchanged smiles and nods, their faith in justice momentarily restored. For the officer, however, the verdict was devastating. His colleagues looked uneasy, unsure of what to say or do. Some tried to offer reassurances, but the damage had already been done. Public scrutiny would follow him now, along with internal investigations that could jeopardize his career. As the proceedings concluded, the driver stood slowly, his legs feeling heavier than usual. He hadn't expected everything to hit him so suddenly, the relief, the vindication, the exhaustion. Reporters swarmed him outside the courthouse, microphones thrust toward his face as cameras flashed. How does it feel to win? One reporter asked. It's not about winning, he replied honestly. It's about standing up for what's right, about showing people that change is possible if we're willing to fight for it. His answer drew cheers from the crowd gathered behind him. Strangers approached to shake his hand or thank him for speaking out. Parents held up their children to catch a glimpse of the man who had dared to challenge the system. But despite the celebration, the driver knew this victory came with complications. Winning in court didn't erase the pain of being treated unfairly. It didn't undo the frustration of fighting a battle he never should have had to fight in the first place. And it certainly didn't solve the larger issues of bias and inequality that persisted in communities everywhere. That evening, back at home, he sat alone on his porch, staring out at the quiet street. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the pavement. He thought about the road ahead, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever felt powerless in the face of injustice. This trial had been a turning point, yes, but it was also a reminder of how much work still needed to be done. Accountability was important, but it wasn't enough on its own. Real change required effort from everyone, individuals, institutions, and communities working together to create a fairer, more equitable world. As he sipped his coffee, he allowed himself a small smile. Today had been a good day. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but he was ready. After all, he'd spent years learning how to persevere, how to keep moving forward no matter what obstacles stood in his way. And as the stars began to twinkle in the night sky, he whispered softly to himself, "One step at a time." The days following the trial were a whirlwind. The driver's story spread like wildfire, capturing headlines not just locally but nationally. News outlets picked up the case, framing it as a powerful example of standing up against injustice. Social media buzzed with hashtags and posts celebrating his courage. People from all walks of life, students, teachers, activists, veterans, reached out to share their support. Some sent heartfelt messages thanking him for inspiring them to speak out. Others shared their own stories of discrimination, finding solace in knowing they weren't alone. For the driver, the attention was overwhelming at first. He wasn't used to being in the spotlight. His years in the Navy had taught him discipline and teamwork, not how to navigate interviews or public speaking events. But he quickly realized that this moment wasn't just about him, it was an opportunity to amplify voices that often went unheard. So, when invitations started pouring in from community groups, advocacy organizations, and even national conferences, he accepted them. His first speaking engagement took place at a local high school auditorium. The room was packed with students, parents, and teachers eager to hear what he had to say. As he stepped onto the stage wearing his Navy uniform once again, the crowd erupted into applause. He smiled softly, feeling both proud and humbled. "Thank you," he began, his voice steady but warm. "I didn't expect so many people to show up today. To be honest, I'm still getting used to all of this." The audience chuckled lightly, breaking the tension. Encouraged by their response, he continued, "What happened to me isn't unique. Far too many people have faced similar situations or worse and haven't had the resources or platform to fight back. That's why I'm here today. Not because I think I'm special, but because I believe we can all make a difference if we stand together." He talked about his journey, the traffic stop, the courtroom battle, the emotional toll it had taken, but he also emphasized hope. "Change doesn't happen overnight," he said. "It starts small, with conversations, with listening to each other, with refusing to accept things as they are when we know they can be better." By the end of his speech, the entire room was on its feet, cheering. Students approached him afterward, asking questions and sharing their dreams of making a difference. One young girl handed him a drawing. She'd made a picture of him standing tall in his uniform, surrounded by words like brave and hero. It brought tears to his eyes. As the weeks turned into months, the driver became a symbol of resilience and determination. He traveled across the country, speaking at rallies, panel discussions, and town halls. Everywhere he went, he reminded people that progress required patience and persistence. "We're planting seeds," he often said. "Some will grow quickly. Others might take years, but every effort counts." Meanwhile, the fallout from the trial continued to unfold. Internal investigations into the officer revealed additional instances of misconduct, leading to his eventual dismissal from the force. While some defended him, arguing that the punishment was too harsh, most agreed that accountability was long overdue. The police department implemented new training programs focused on bias awareness and de-escalation techniques, though critics pointed out that policy changes alone wouldn't fix systemic issues. Still, it was a start. Back home, the driver remained deeply involved in his community. He joined local initiatives aimed at bridging gaps between law enforcement and residents. He attended neighborhood meetings, listened to concerns, and worked alongside others to build trust. It wasn't always easy. There were disagreements, misunderstandings, and moments of frustration, but he stayed committed. One evening, as he sat on his porch watching the sunset, a neighbor stopped by to chat. They talked about everything from rising property taxes to the upcoming school board elections. Eventually, the conversation turned to the trial. "You've done something amazing," the neighbor said sincerely. "People look up to you now. You've given them hope." The driver shook his head modestly. "I didn't do anything extraordinary. I just stood up for myself when I needed to. Anyone could do the same." But the neighbor disagreed. "Not Everyone has the strength to face that kind of challenge, and not everyone inspires others the way you have. Don't underestimate the impact you've had. Those words stuck with him. Later that night, as he lay in bed thinking about the past few months, he realized something important. Change wasn't about one person doing everything alone. It was about inspiring others to join the fight, about creating ripples that grew into waves. He thought about the young girl who'd given him her drawing, the students asking questions after his speeches, the neighbors working together to improve their community. Each of them carried a piece of the puzzle, contributing in their own way. Still, he knew the road ahead wouldn't be smooth. Racism and inequality were deeply rooted problems, and dismantling them would take generations of effort. There would be setbacks, moments of doubt, and times when it felt like nothing was changing. But he refused to let that discourage him. Instead, he focused on the victories, no matter how small. Like the time a teenager told him he wanted to become a lawyer to help people like him. Or the day a local business owner announced plans to hire more diverse staff. These moments reminded him why he kept going. In the end, the driver's legacy wasn't defined by the trial itself, but by what came after. By the conversations sparked, the policies reformed, and the lives touched. He didn't see himself as a hero, just as someone who had chosen to act when it mattered most. And as he stood before another crowd months later, preparing to tell his story yet again, he smiled, knowing that his journey was far from over. Every speech, every meeting, every handshake was a step toward a brighter future. It's not about perfection, he told the audience that day. It's about progress, about taking one step forward even when it feels like two steps back sometimes. Because if we keep moving, if we keep believing, then maybe, just maybe, we can leave this world a little better than we found it. The applause that followed was thunderous, echoing through the room like a promise. A promise that change was possible, that justice was worth fighting for, and that no one had to face these battles alone.